The smell hits you before anything else. It is not the smell of rot exactly, not the sharp chemical sting you might expect. It is something older than that, something layered, decades of compacted earth, methane curling invisibly through cracked clay, the ghost of 10,000 meals, and a million discarded lives pressing upward through the ground like memory itself. Welcome to Freshkills, 1,400 acres of land on the western edge of Staten Island, New York. For over half a century, this was the largest landfill in the history of human civilization. At its peak, it received more than 29,000 tons of New York City's waste every single day. Sanitation barges would cross the Kilvan Cool, loaded to the waterline, arriving in an endless procession that never seemed to stop. The mounds grew and grew and grew, until two of them, West Mound and North Mound, rose higher than the Statue of Liberty herself. Mountains built entirely from the things we threw away. But here is what nobody warned you about. Freshkills is quiet now, not the uneasy silence of a place waiting to resume its chaos. A different kind of quiet, the kind that means something has moved in, something patient and wild and utterly indifferent to what we once did here. And the rats, the millions of rats that for decades ruled this place like shadow emperors, are gone, not displaced, not relocated, gone. The question is how, and the answer will make you reconsider everything you think you know about what nature actually is and what it is capable of when we stop paying attention. To understand what happened at Freshkills, you have to understand what Freshkills was. It opened in 1947. Robert Moses, that most monolithic of city planners, approved it as a temporary measure. 3 years, perhaps 5, to process the overflow, while a more permanent solution was designed. It closed 53 years later. In 2001, briefly, heartbreakingly, it reopened one final time to receive the debris of the World Trade Center. Then it closed again, and the city turned away. But in that turning away, in that moment of institutional exhaustion and grief, something else turned toward it. The ecology of a landfill is not nothing. This is worth saying plainly, because our instinct is to treat these places as dead zones, as anti-nature, as the photographic negative of a meadow or a forest. But a landfill in full operation is, in its own terrible way, extraordinarily alive. The decomposition of organic waste releases heat. The interior of a large mound can reach temperatures of 60 degrees Celsius, warm as tropical soil. The methane that rises through it feeds methanogenic archaea, ancient microorganisms that predate the dinosaurs, quietly doing what they have always done. Rats, gulls, opossums, raccoons, feral cats, all of them drawn to the extraordinary caloric density of concentrated human waste. At its height, Freshkills hosted an estimated population of several million rats. Think about that for a moment, not just the number itself, but what it implies, the social complexity, the territorial hierarchies, the nightly foraging patterns, the smell of that many animals living in that particular density on that particular soil. The Norway rat, Rattus norvegicus, is a creature of extraordinary intelligence. It remembers, it communicates, it passes learned behaviors, what to eat, what to fear, between generations through observation and touch. A rat colony is not a collection of individuals. It is something more like a distributed mind. And the feral cats came because the rats were there. Of course they did. That is how it always works. Predator follows prey, across 10,000 years of domestication and wild intermingling, back to something older and more fundamental than the category of pet ever captured. The cats of Freshkills were not domestic animals living roughly. They were, in any meaningful ecological sense, wild, born wild, living wild, hunting wild. Many had never known a human hand except as a source of danger. So you had, at the moment of closure, an ecosystem of a very particular kind. Crude, opportunistic, built on garbage, but an ecosystem nonetheless, with structure, with relationships, with what ecologists would reluctantly carefully call function. And then the food disappeared. This is the part that people miss when they think about landfill closure. They think about the waste stopping. They do not think about what that means for the animals who organize their entire lives around it. When Freshkills closed to incoming waste in 2001, it did not empty overnight. The existing mounds remained. The decomposition continued. But the daily tonnage, that extraordinary caloric subsidy that had sustained millions of animals for decades, stopped. The effect on the rat population was not gradual, it was catastrophic. Rat ecologists, and yes, there are rat ecologists, people who have devoted their professional lives to understanding these animals with the same depth and rigor we apply to wolves or whales, will tell you that rat populations are extraordinarily sensitive to food availability. A superabundance of food creates what is called a population bloom. Remove the food, and you do not simply reduce the population proportionally, you collapse it. The social structure fragments, the territorial boundaries break down, disease spreads faster in the stress and crowding of competition. Starvation thins the juveniles first, then the old, then the healthy adults who hold the colonies together. Within a handful of years after closure, the rat population at Freshkills had fallen by an estimated 90%. But here is where it gets strange. The remaining 10% did not simply survive on diminishing returns and slowly fade. Something else happened. Something that, when you hear it, sounds almost like a story someone invented, but is documented, observed, and now studied with growing intensity by the ecologists working on the Freshkills Park restoration project. The rats that remained began to change their behavior, not genetically, not in the short term at least, behaviorally. The foraging patterns shifted, the colony structures compressed, and most remarkably, there is evidence, contested, debated, but present, that the remaining rat population became more cautious, more cryptic, more genuinely wild in its habits than the generations that had fed openly at the mountain of garbage before them. Selection pressure is always working, we forget this. We think of evolution as something that happens in geological time in the deep past among creatures with names we cannot pronounce. But it is happening right now, in the rats of Staten Island, in the bacteria in your gut, in every living thing that faces a changed world and must, generation by generation, find a new way through it. And the cats? The cats are a harder story to tell, harder and stranger, and in some ways more important. Feral cat populations in urban environments are one of the most contentious ecological debates of the last 30 years. The numbers are genuinely staggering. Estimates suggest between 60 and 100 million feral cats live in the United States alone, making them one of the most numerous large predators on the continent. They kill, by conservative estimates, between 1 and 4 billion birds every year in America. They are, from the perspective of native wildlife, an introduced predator of extraordinary impact. But what happened at Freshkills complicates the simple narrative. When the food subsidy collapsed, the feral cat population did what cat populations always do under resource pressure. It declined sharply, then stabilized at a lower density, but the cats that remained did something unexpected. They hunted, not scavenged, hunted. The meadows that began to grow across the capped landfill surface, grasses and wildflowers pushing up through the engineered clay barriers, successional vegetation doing what successional vegetation always does, colonizing bare ground with cheerful indifference to what lies beneath. These meadows created habitat. Meadow voles moved in, cottontail rabbits, white-footed mice. The invertebrate communities that support small mammals began to establish themselves in the maturing soil, and the cats pivoted, completely and apparently permanently. Researchers documenting the wildlife of what is now officially named Freshkills Park, the long, ambitious, still unfolding project to transform the former landfill into a nearly 2,000-acre public park and ecological restoration, have recorded feral cat predation patterns that look almost nothing like the urban feral cat studies conducted in other environments. These cats are taking meadow voles at rates that suggest specialized hunting behavior. They are avoiding human contact with the consistency of animals that have, over several generations, selected hard for wariness. Are they an ecological problem? Almost certainly for some species. Are they also, undeniably, a part of what is now a functioning, self-organizing ecological community? Yes, that too. Nature does not deal in purity, it deals in relationships. Above all of this, above the rats and the cats and the voles and the bacteria eating methane in the dark, the birds arrived. This is perhaps the most visually arresting part of the Freshkills story, and the one that requires the longest view to fully understand. Grassland birds in North America are in catastrophic decline. Bobolinks, meadowlarks, grasshopper sparrows, savanna sparrows species whose entire evolutionary history is written in the open, grass-covered landscapes that once stretched from horizon to horizon across the interior of the continent. Prairie, savanna, meadow, all of it fragmented, developed, row-cropped into near invisibility. The birds that need these habitats have nowhere to go, except, increasingly, they are going to places like Freshkills. The restored grasslands of Freshkills Park now host breeding populations of grasshopper sparrows, a species of significant conservation concern. Bobolinks have been documented, killdeer nest on the gravel paths. American kestrels, the smallest falcon in North America, hunt the open meadows the way their ancestors hunted the prairies, their burnt orange and slate blue plumage catching the late afternoon light above ground that was, not so long ago, a mountain of New York City's waste. There is something almost unbearably moving about this. Not because it is a feel-good story exactly. The methane still rises. The clay caps require constant monitoring. The soil will not be safe for unrestricted agriculture for generations. The restoration is incomplete, partial, contested, expensive, and will require active management for the foreseeable future. Nobody should pretend otherwise. But the kestrel does not know any of that. The kestrel sees open sky and long grass and the tiny movement of a vole 30 feet below, and it dives and it catches, and it returns to its perch on a fence post, and it eats. And in that act, ancient, indifferent, precise, it is exactly what it has always been. There is a concept in restoration ecology called the shifting baseline. It was described by the fisheries biologist Daniel Pauly in 1995, but it applies far beyond fisheries. The idea is this: each generation of scientists, each generation of humans, tends to measure the health of an ecosystem against what they remember from their own childhood, their own experience. If you grew up when the cod stocks were already depleted feels like normal. If you grew up when the passenger pigeon was gone, a sky without passenger pigeons feels like a sky. We do not mourn what we never knew to expect. Freshkills forces this question in an unusual direction. Because Freshkills was, within living memory, an ecological catastrophe. And now it is a place where grassland birds breed and foxes den and turtles bask on the shores of the tidal creeks that were once buried under refuse. If your baseline is 2001, what is happening here looks like a miracle. If your baseline is 1600, what is happening here is a pale and partial and still contaminated fragment of what once was. Both of those things are true simultaneously, and perhaps that is the more honest way to hold all of this. Not as a redemption story, not as proof that everything will be fine if we just give nature enough time, but as evidence of something more unsettling and more hopeful at once, that life does not require our permission, that it moves into the gaps we leave, that the hierarchy we place ourselves at the top of is, from the perspective of the meadow vole, or the kestrel, or the methane archaea, essentially irrelevant. The last thing I want to tell you about Freshkills is something small. In the spring, when the meadows on West Mound are coming into bloom, when the bird's foot trefoil is yellow and the wild bergamot is just beginning to open, and the grasses are that particular electric green that only happens for about 2 weeks before the summer deepens and darkens them, you can stand at the top of the mound and see, on a clear day, the Manhattan skyline to the northeast, the same city whose garbage built the ground beneath your feet. And if you are quiet, and you are patient, and you know where to look, you might see a bobolink rising out of the grass in that extraordinary bubbling display flight that looks like a mechanical toy and sounds like R2-D2, and is, in its own strange way, one of the most joyful things that happens anywhere on this continent in the month of June. It has no idea what it is standing on. It has no idea what was here before. It knows only that the grass is tall enough to hide a nest, and the insects are abundant, and the sky above is open and blue. And maybe that is the thing, maybe that is the question worth sitting with long after the screen goes dark. Not what we did to this place, not even what we are doing to restore it, but what it means that life, relentless, inventive, structurally indifferent to our narratives about it, keeps finding its way back, keeps finding the gaps, keeps asking nothing of us except that we leave it a little room. The mound that was once taller than the Statue of Liberty now smells, in spring, of warm earth and wild bergamot, and the faint electric sweetness of living grass. Something is singing in it, something that was never asked to forgive us, and somehow came anyway.